Hello. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Sophia Nahlawi, author event coordinator here at the Pratt Library, and thank you again for joining us. First, some general housekeeping. Today's program is going to be a 45-minute talk and a 15-minute Q&A. I will be pulling questions from you lovely folks here in person as well as our online audience. There will be a signing after the program as well at the table on your right, my left side of the room. Our book selling partner tonight, Greedy Reads, is selling copies of tonight's book. So if you haven't already, they will be available for purchase at the end of the program as well. And we have another sci-fi title next week on Tuesday by Ray Naylor, Where the Axe is Buried. If you are still interested, forever interested in sci-fi, please come on down and join us next week. And so now, tonight's program. Tonight, I'm happy to welcome Stacy Nathaniel Jackson to the Pratt Library to discuss his book, The Ephemera Collector. The year is 2035, and Los Angeles County is awash in a tangelo haze of wildfire smoke. Xandria Anastasia Brown spends her days deep in the archives of the Huntington Library as the curator of African American Ephemera and associate curator of American Historical Manuscripts, supported by an array of AI personal assistants and health bots. Sequestered in the archive with only her adaptive technology and flickering intuition, Xandria fears that her life's work is in danger. The Duwata Collection, a radical blueprint for humanity's survival. Up against a faceless enemy and unsure of who her human or AI allies truly are, she must make a choice. Stacy Nathaniel Jackson will be joined in conversation this evening by novelist Leslie Tenario. Stacy Nathaniel Jackson is a trans poet, playwright, and visual artist whose work has appeared in Electric Literature, Georgia Review, and New American Writing, among other publications. Leslie Tenario is the author of the novel The Son of Good Fortune and the story collection Monstrous. He is a professor in the writing seminars at Johns Hopkins University. Publishers Weekly's starred review called The Ephemera Collector an ambitious homage to Octavia Butler. This stunning near-future mosaic novel from debut author Jackson melds prose, poetry, memos, advertisements, and dream journal doodles. Jackson is an exciting new voice in Afrofuturism. And in another starred review, the Library Journal wrote, the scope of Jackson's debut is breathtaking, from gripping suspense to serene contemplation to the scientific presentation of articles of history and imagination. Highly recommended for those who seek to understand the past and reimagine the future. It's my great pleasure to welcome Stacy Nathaniel Jackson and Leslie Tenario.
These are on. Can you hear me? Great. Hi, Stacy.
Hello.
Well, first of all, thank you everyone for coming. And it's so nice to be in this room. I haven't been in this room before, but I feel like we're on some sort of like Masterpiece Theater, PBS, literary talk show. There should be like, I was gonna say there should be a fireplace. There is a fireplace.
It's gorgeous.
It's so nice.
It's a real library.
Yeah.
A book about an archivist starting off in a real library. I'm excited.
It's faded. Well, first of all, congratulations on
Thank you.
not only just your book, but your debut book. What a way to start! What a way to land! So congratulations. I hope you're celebrating, and I'm excited to talk to you about it. Before we start with our conversation, would you be open to reading a little bit from the book?
Absolutely.
Okay, great.
Xandria stretched her arms to the ceiling, rolled her wrists. She sat up on the daybed and massaged the annoying crick in her neck, taking in the mess on the conference table, a disposable plate with something crusty, a tri-pack of unopened emergency water. Her clothes were musty. Recollection was hazy, probably an all-nighter. Lucid dreams intermittent. She continued to survey the room, turned to a gap in the corner. Cypress telepresence was gone. On her feet now, imbalanced, she stumbled into the executive restroom adjacent to the daybed. Was there a shelter-in-place order? She looked at herself in the mirror, regretted it. Sepia-colored bags under her eyes bulged like puffed pastry. She forced a deep breath, exhaled, and turned the tap. Luckily, water hadn't been cut off. After splashing her face, she sat to pee. She noticed body wipes and emergency bar wrappers in the trash. No test swabs. What day is it? She looked at the keloid scar between her left index and middle finger, her implant. The scar was a subtle reminder that the implant procedure was the last time she went to a human doctor. Still visible after placement, shouldn't have been, subdermal. The American Medical Association's sanctioned research on biometric implants had all been done on white skin, not black. Performed on futurist first adopters, usually male, not middle-aged women of color. Skeptical, the kindest kind of spin to put on it. It wasn't any wonder, though, why she didn't trust health tech advocates. The AMA was slow to adjust its oversight practices and predispositions. Resistant to an upgrade, she allowed the 15-year-old microchip to do what it needed without her needing to know. The RFID was multi-purpose. Retail purchases without a digital wallet, opening secure doors, sending health data electronically to primary care physicians and specialists. No need to remember dozens of passwords. No need for continued consent or constant opting in. Earlier in the year, in her efforts to self-diagnose memory mix-ups, she started tracking various academic white papers focused on memory research. A military-funded study that tested neural implants, dubbed prosthetic memory, was of particular interest. Patients had been implanted with chips to assist with short-term memory issues, and the early findings were promising. She had also read about the biology of multiple memory systems in patients with amnesia. Although the report was fascinating, she ruled out retrograde amnesia as the cause of her own issues. After reading National Institute of Health federally funded medical research reports. She had told Inanna she felt like an undergraduate research subject again. Her formal reconnection to Everin overdue. She had started to have doubts about its medical tethering. She removed her wrist wearable to wash her hands, returned to her desk, and searched for her earpiece. She placed her hand on her chest, fiddled with the chain she almost never removed from her neck. The memorial dog tag provided a grounding moment, despite the grief it restirred. Pushing past her comfort, she read the engraving aloud as if reciting a prayer. Octavia Estelle Butler, Mountain View Cemetery, Altadena, Grave 6, Lot 4517, Eagles View. Confused, she scrubbed at her eyes, found the earpiece near her task screen, secured it with a tight fit inside her ear, sat back on the daybed to initiate a reboot to Everin.
Thanks so much. Did you do your own book on tape? The audiobook, did you read it?
They hired somebody else.
Because I was gonna say, because you, I know it's a lot of work, but you read so well. I was like, oh, you should do my next. If I have a next book, you do mine.
They hired someone by the name of Diana Blue. We'll see. I'm excited to listen to it.
Oh, okay. Well, thanks for reading. Okay, so I have a lot of questions. Sophia took one of my quotes. I was also going to quote from Publishers Weekly. What starred review? Okay, I'll requote your quote. 2-star reviews already, Library Journal and Publishers Weekly. And Publishers Weekly said it's stunning, propulsive, and that you're an exciting new voice in Afrofuturism. For those who might not be familiar with the genre, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about Afrofuturism, but more specifically, how your book is approaching that genre, what you're trying to say about it.
Yes, Afrofuturism is a cultural movement, if you will. It's not just literature. Um, People might think of Black Panther or Sun Ra in music. It's got a long lineage. Octavia Butler, one of my favorite speculative fiction, science fiction writers. My agent said, "Oh, your book is hard fiction and hard science fiction." So how that melds into Afrofuturism, I wouldn't really know, other than it was important for me in terms of my personality and who I am to kind of blend genres, if you will. So in a certain degree, Afrofuturism is about the future, is about Black futures. And it was important for me to write a book where, yeah, we're going to survive. We're going to survive.
Yeah, that feels important, especially now, to be making that kind of statement in a
Mhm.
book. Xandria is a really fantastic protagonist. She is an archivist. She is someone who is currently working on preservation for the Dewata Collective, which is a Black separatist population that has established themselves as like an undersea population in Northern California. So as an archivist, she's concerned with preservation and memory and obviously ephemera, but she's also someone whose memory is disrupted due to long COVID. So her memory is fragmented, and I think the fragmentation of her memory is reflected in some of the formal choices you make in the book. It's a powerful irony, you know, an archivist who is struggling with memory. Could you talk about how you came up, not just with that premise, but just with Xandria as a protagonist? It's hard to pick a main character. How did she come to you?
Well, I'm 65, and folks who are, not everybody, but it will happen.
It happened to me today at some point while I was teaching class.
It's gonna happen. So, with that said, that's really my personal connection to that. In 2018, my mother passed away. 3 months later, her older sister passed away. 4 months later, another sister passed away. So 3 sisters passed away within a matter of 1 year. I'm just gonna sidebar. One of my aunties she was 90 something, and she actually got kicked out of hospice. She was living that long until my mom got sick. And she looked over in the grave and said, Aki, I'll be out. I'm going to see you soon. And literally, she was gone in a couple of months. That's personal grief that I was dealing with, still dealing with, but then I'll say, collective grief of COVID hit. And part of what happens what's stated in the book, narrated, is that's the worst thing. How you know, not just losing love, but forgetting you even had it. And so I don't know if that's how I came up with her, but that's, for me, that personal sense of grief was what I wanted to write into.
Well, that personal connection, I mean, this doesn't read autobiographically, but the personal connection, I think, really manifests in just how powerfully she comes across on the page. So thanks for sharing that. You described the novel as a story within the story of an imagined future with a spotlight on loss, grief, health inequity, resilience, the promise of super artificial intelligence, and unintended consequences. It's also a very political book. You know, you'll read this, sections about Black Lives Matter, Breonna Taylor, COVID. So there's a lot happening. Given everything that goes on in this book, dramatically, thematically, politically, how did you come up with a storyline for it? I mean, it's one thing to come up with themes and ideas, but you have to fit those things into an actual story. How did you come up with the story?
So you mentioned it didn't read autobiographically. I also think of it as speculative memoir. And that's how I came up with this stuff.
Yeah.
Because these were either things that have happened in my life or things that I thought, well, what if, even to begin with, I imagined Xandria to be my grandkid. And so if my grandkid was a millennial, what would be the things that that person would go through or see, not just in their own personal life, but how would they be affected by the things that were, happening in the world?
Yeah.
I don't know if that answers your question.
Oh, yeah,
but-
absolutely.
Okay.
I love that. Did you just coin that, speculative memoir?
No, I didn't coin it. Some people are working on it, but what it actually means, I don't, in practice, that's up for debate.
Yeah. So technology features prominently in your excerpt you talked about, she doesn't have a human doctor. She has a health bot. Could you talk about your interest in technology and how it just came to be so prominent in the book? Especially because, we're a lot of us are a little suspicious right now with AI, so it's definitely topical, and there's a lot of apprehension about some of these technologies. So I was wondering if you could talk about maybe what you're trying to investigate or ask about technology in the book.
Again, back to the personal, I can't stand it, right? I don't talk to Siri and I don't talk to Alexa. I know other friends do, I just won't do it. And I try not to, when there's a helper bot on the line, I usually try to punch the numbers because I don't trust it, right? I mean, part of that is personal, and part of that is growing up in a culture where basically things were done to us. I mean, I think my parents died of just being afraid of the medical, system because they just didn't trust it. So there's that. My father was also an electrical engineer, and he worked on the Viking project to Mars in the 70s. So to a certain degree, I was surrounded by applied science. Thirdly, I was a finance person. I told you earlier that I have retired early from finance, but my wife Tammy is a wealth manager. And during the time that I was writing this book, and always, the CNBC is always kind of in the background and listening to investment theses of all sorts. And clearly, even now, but even then, generative AI and sort of technology, the blockchain, all that stuff kind of made its way into the book.
You're probably the first novelist I've ever met who actually has financial knowledge. So kudos to you. That's amazing. I have more questions about the book, but I'm hoping
Sure.
we can depart for a moment. You talked about your career in finance. I also know that you're a visual artist. Could you just talk about how you got to writing? And this is your first book. You've had careers in other fields. How did writing come about? Was this something you grew up wanting to do? Was this influenced by your family?
Well, once again, back to the speculative memoir. I got in trouble for writing a story. It's actually masked in the book. I got in trouble for writing a book report, and I made up the story. And the book was Valley of the Dolls. And I went to Catholic school. And I thought it was funny. And I usually read my dad's book. I didn't read all of his book. I usually just started, kind of the front and the back, the middle, flipped through it. And I wrote a book report. And I, even back then, I liked art. So the cover had sequins and all kinds of stuff. But then somebody told a nun what that book was. So my father and my mother, we got pulled into the principal's office. He had to take off of work. So I learned that my inclinations were a little edgy and risky even then. So I never felt safe, really, to write seriously.
Yeah.
That's a true story.
I love that. I love how the first thing you wrote, you got you in trouble. And I love that. Are you all familiar with Valley of the Dolls? It's a camp classic, and go check it out. Fantastic movie, too.
I never read the book. I saw the movie, but I never read the book. Not really.
Yeah. Could you talk about growing up in California and now finding yourself here? We have something in common. He'd spent 30 years in San Francisco, and then during the pandemic moved to DC. I spent 22 years in San Francisco and moved here about 2 years ago. So how has, what brought on the move, and how are things going from one coast to the next?
There are seasons in the East. In California, not so much. Well, in Southern California, not so much. Northern California, they're sort of, but they're different. But growing up in Southern California, it's really, people believe there's an earthquake season. Technically, scientifically, that's not true. Fire season, unfortunately, we know that actually is true, the Santa Anas, but other than that, it's warm or it occasionally rains. That's it. You've got to go to the mountains for the snow. So that's a key difference.
Are you liking seasons?
Yeah. You got to buy clothes, right, for different seasons. I wasn't used to that.
Yeah.
You just, even in the Bay Area, you have a jacket, not wool or anything. You certainly don't have, not necessarily hats unless you want to look good. And snow boots, what is that?
Right.
So I like it. I like it.
Yeah, I like the seasons too. I think it's good to be forced, to have to adapt 4 times a year. Okay, I'm going to get back to the book here. So I told you earlier, and I went into this book not knowing anything about it, not knowing anything about you. So it was really kind of interesting to just sort of enter this world. And page 2, page 3, I saw the word Diwata, which is a Tagalog word, Tagalog being language of the Philippines. And Diwata broadly means like a benevolent spirit or a nature goddess or something like that. So your mother was Filipina. Could you talk about your Filipino background, how that has factored into the book, if at all? Because I love the way that the Diwata has a kind of, some touch of Filipino culture is braided here with aspects of Afrofuturism. So could you talk about that?
So I don't know much about my Filipino heritage other than we were speaking, a couple of aunts and uncles were born in the Philippines. There was some food that we grew up with that, my aunties cooked.
Spam. If you're Filipino, you know.
I don't know if this was Filipino or not, but my grandma was probably 4'9". She smoked unfiltered cigarettes. She'd strike a match on the back of her slipper. I mean, she was
So badass.
yeah. But the play on Dawada, I mean, I'm part of this book, again, as it being, again, in my mind, speculative memoirs, searching and creating, filling in the gaps, not only of Xandria in the plot line, but for me, filling in the gaps of my own family history and culture. So it's another Easter egg. But truthfully, though, and I don't exactly remember the name of it, but there is a study. Was it a study? I don't know. The Philippines literally launched a rocket or a missile or something. I don't know, and they called it They named it Dewada.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they did. They did.
Oh, I'll have to look that up. Interesting. You had mentioned in an article I'd read that for you the book is like a love letter to your family history, but it's also a love letter to, I think, what you called your literary ancestry. Could you talk about your literary ancestry and how that ancestry has helped get you to this book?
So I have to go back to Octavia Butler. I did not know her, obviously, but when I found out that she passed away, actually, Tran Tran, a poet, called me and said, she passed away, and I'm not the only one that feels that way about her, though. It was as if, a family member had died. Her archives are actually in the Huntington Library, which this book is set in. And the archives, I think it was 2017. Yeah, my mom died in 2018. It was one of the last events that she loved the Huntington. We lived in South Pasadena, and the Huntington, well, San Marino and South Pasadena are border cities. So we went there a lot. And that was one of the last events that we had, enjoyed together before she died. So there are multiple kind of layers to that.
Since you mentioned the Huntington Library, could you talk about the Huntington Library? It's, for those of you who don't know, it's this beautiful, it's like in a park, it's a museum, it's also, I know they have like research fellowships there.
They
Could you
do.
talk a little bit more about it and your experience with it growing up?
So yeah, I grew up near it. It's a place that people in South Pasadena, San Marino, Alhambra go for, field trips. At least we did back then. It's about 200 acres. When my editor was reading the first draft, I think, and there's a scene where Xandria is walking from one building to the next. She's like, well, how could that be? Why is it taking so long? Because she's thinking of a library like this.
Right.
And it's a beautiful place. It's not the only place, obviously, Octavia Butler chose it for her archives. I'm also art collector. My wife and I are art collectors, and we got the pleasure of meeting Betty Saar, who's still alive in her 90s. She's just getting known to other people, but she's collage, assemblage, that kind of thing, and she actually has a show there now. So it full circle. The Huntington is just. Oh, and my mother was definitely a gardener, so the botanical gardens are really important to her.
Oh, that's great. Reading the book, I'm thinking about the Huntington Library, just libraries in general, archives, museums, etc. And in our current moment, libraries and museums aren't in the best shape, and I think they're in peril, which is frightening. Could you talk about how the current moment, politically, I'm thinking, influenced writing the book, but also just maybe influences your work in general, because you're a visual artist, you're a poet. How does the state of the world relate to your work and your process?
Thank you for that question. So in terms of poetry, I don't know very many people do this, but I always research before I even write a poem. So it's the kind of poet that I am. I'm not really coming from just a personal place, but for me, it's important to say something about history. It may be family history, but more than likely, it's tying back to African American history. Mars science oftentimes is an extended metaphor for me. Folks are scared, obviously, and what's happening with this administration, it's not just focused in one area. So the American Library Association, or I can't remember the words, but what is it? American, maybe you don't know.
The ALA?
Say it again? American Library Association, but there may be some other organization tied to libraries that's there, some funding is going to get cut, right? What do we do? What do we do? Well, as an artist, as a writer, don't stop making art. Don't stop creating. Don't, you know, that's the only thing that I can think of and say.
Yeah, it's definitely tough, but I was grateful to have this book because reading it, it's hard. Sometimes we read to escape, and that's a legitimate, endeavor. Reading this, I kept sort of like looking up and feeling like the world is happening, and this is somehow speaking to it. So, but there was some kind of solace in knowing that things like this continue, that art continues to be made, because that, in a way, can be a political act, a subversive act. So I appreciated having this in my hands, especially in recent times. So
I think the form also is subversive. For readers who may want to enter it, it's not linear. Okay, it's not linear at all. And to some, it may feel jump cutty, to use metaphor, I guess, or a technique really in film. But it's real life in my mind. In my mind, I wanted to write someone that, had grown up with, folks around because of redlining, environmental injustice. Speaking of which, I grew up in South Pasadena, but that was a fluke. All of my relatives in Southern California lived in Altadena and Pasadena. One of my cousins did lose her family home. It could have been us. I should say, in terms of the Great Migration, my father was born in Los Angeles, and so my father was raised by his great-grandmother, and so it's like 4 generations of Los Angelinos, really. And so place was really important for me as well, to write into place. Right. So that's in the book as well.
Yeah. You'd mentioned that I think you used the term jump cutty, and in the best way it is. And I think the book has been described as a kind of mosaic. Mm-hmm. I don't know, I'm going to put this down real quick. Mm-hmm. Just to give a sense of how this book is so innovatively and experimentally structured. If you just look at this, I mean, you've got graphics, you have things that read like found documents, poetry, images. I couldn't help but feel as though the book mirrored the way memory sometimes works, which is fragmented and disruptive and sudden, but we also live that way. Our attention spans just shift among so many different things. Could you talk about how you constructed this book? I was asking you earlier, what was editing a book, the editing process for a book like this like with your editor? Because I'm a fairly traditional, conventional kind of writer, so I look at this and I'm kind of just blown away and I admire it, really. But how did you conceive of this structure, of this format, and what was editing like for a book like this?
So you asked a question earlier. Also, I want to mention the book Omeros. It's actually an epic poem. Okay, here it comes. It's not coming. Has anybody read Omeros by Derek Walcott? Thank you. Thank you to myself for remembering.
I think we need to thank ourselves more in this day and age, so good for you.
That book is 8,500 lines. It's in a form called terza rima, which it's basically each stanza is 3 lines. I was working I began a poem in graduate school, and I had not finished it. And I thought, during that time, my mom passed away, etc. I was wanting to do something creative. The other thing about being a visual artist, you need space. You usually need space. I don't really have it. So writing is an outlet for me. And I wanted to finish it. So basically the way that I see the structure of the book, or how I initially saw it, was it's a poem with a novel wrapped around it. Now that's not going to sell. But to a certain degree, that's what it is. And the poem at the end, the Dewada collection, formally, it's in ottava rima, which is 8 lines, stanzas, and it's got a rhyme scheme A, B, A, B, A, B, C, C. I write in slant rhyme, so it's not hard. It's soft. Each rhyme isn't exactly spot on, and I also use a lot of caesura that sort of if I read it to you, you won't see where the line cuts are. If you see it, you'll obviously know. And then my editor was like, more Dewada, more Dewada, more Dewada, pull it forward, pull it forward, pull it forward. So she was the one. I didn't want that. For a traditional fiction editor, they would probably say, like, what is this? And cut it off. And she helped me to pull it forward.
That's great. And you'd mentioned that your editor is also a fiction writer and a poet. So
She
speculative,
doesn't
or-
write, but she's a fantastic editor. So she's a fiction and poetry editor at Live Right.
Okay. And how was going from poetry, which you'd been writing, into suddenly getting into the genre of fiction? How is that movement?
Really interesting. I'm also a playwright, and so the way that I approach the book is, to me, it's character driven. So there are a lot of technology, algorithm, bots, robots that have an inner life in the book. And to me, they're just another character. And so I took it from the perspective of a dramatist in terms of writing, like, what do they want? What's in their way? How are they going to get it?
The book, as I'd mentioned earlier, has been described as a mosaic. And when you have a book structured so innovatively, fragmentedly by design, you're still responsible for carrying a reader through from beginning to end. How did you conceive of a plot for this book, given its structure and given the way a reader experiences, going from one form literally to another form, sometimes moving on to image? How did you manage all that, but still keep in mind this needs a plot, this needs a storyline, this needs drama?
I don't really know if I'm not a fiction writer. I mean, I don't identify.
It's a
as
thing to admit when you've got a debut novel out in the world published by Norton.
Let me
Don't tell your publicist.
Let me rephrase that. I don't identify primarily as a fiction writer. I'm going to tell you a real sidebar. It's interesting. The reason I say that is the writer Roxane Gay, recently at a writing conference in Los Angeles. I wasn't there, but I listened to her. She was the keynote speaker, and she said most people know of her as, know her nonfiction, but she considers herself a short story fiction writer, even though the rest of the world doesn't.
Yeah.
So I felt okay saying that. But I wasn't trained in my MFA program as a fiction writer, so I didn't know the rules.
Yeah.
I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, for sure.
I didn't start off with, let me think about this plot.
Yeah.
And how I'm going to get, from A to Z.
Right. Well, reading this book, I didn't get a sense of rules. I mean, but it still comes together, and I think that's what's so impressive, and any opportunity to experience a novel that forces you to rethink, if you care about these things, to rethink what narrative is and how narrative operates. This defies all those beliefs, and it's really the kind of book I should be assigning my students, to sort of
Oh, why
break.
don't you?
I will, just to break them out of their, some of their comfort zones. I am actually. Oh, I do have another question here that I wanted to get before my last set. Could you please describe your writing day? Like a good
Oh
writing day.
my
Like, what's your
God.
space like? What are your routines? Do you have any talismans or rituals or like preferred snacks by your computer? Mine is gin.
Well, I can't read my own handwriting. So if I actually sometimes I use scratch paper to write the poem. But usually it's walking the dog, and all my anti-computer compute really is what people are calling it, compute technology. I write notes on my iPhone. So that's what I do. And I do research. If I'm doing research, I'll find something and forward something to notes. And so the ephemera collector has on my phone literally just notes and dialogue. And then I like research. So I wrote a book about a researcher, like an archivist, and I've got a document that's like 200 pages of links and research and thoughts of the real science behind some of these things.
And do you mostly write at home, or do you have to work outside of the home to get work done?
I have a little nook outside of our bedroom where my computer is. And so sometimes our dog sits, down, and I know some people, my last full-length play that I wrote, I was told, just write it, don't edit, don't edit, just write it. And I was able to get a full length in 3 weeks. For fiction poetry, I don't, short stories, I can't seem to do that. I'm kind of constantly editing.
We're going to open it up to the audience soon, but before we get to that, I was hoping you'd be okay with doing a little speed round of questions. Kind of like Actors Studio, that sort of thing at the end.
Oh.
So, you ready? Okay. What's the best museum in DC?
The Museum of African American History and Culture, of course.
Excellent. Favorite tech device, since technology features so prominently in the book?
Is an iPhone a tech device?
I hope so. Yeah.
Because I would say that.
Okay. Movie adaptation. Who plays Xandria?
Oh. Tammy, what's her name? She's a little too old, though. Who's my favorite actress? It's the memory thing again. I'm sorry, y'all. She was in Black Panther. Thank you. Thank you. Angela Bassett.
Okay. I was thinking that too. Food, spicy or mild?
Spicy.
Spicy, okay. Aisle or window?
It's got to be the aisle so I can get to the bathroom.
Yeah. I also do the aisle. Favorite season now that you're on the East Coast?
Summer.
Really? Wow, you're brave.
I like to swim.
Oh, there you go. Favorite poem? Probably an unfair question to ask a poet.
Well, yeah. But I can recite it. It's by, believe it or not, it's by Margaret Atwood.
Oh, yeah,
It's
please.
called You Fit Into Me.
Yeah.
You fit into me like a hand, a hook and eye, a fish hook, an open eye.
Great. I remember reading that in the Norton at Berkeley.
Yeah.
That's a great one. Favorite Octavia Butler novel?
I don't know. I can't pick one.
Okay,
Yeah.
fair enough. Finally, can you recommend 3 books for the audience?
I would actually recommend Omeros by Derek Walcott, particularly if you're not used to poetry, but it's a long narrative. Um, on my bookshelf, I haven't gotten to it, but Tananarive Due is an African American horror writer. She wrote The Reformatory. I just bought it. Uh, she's someone that I'm really interested in as well because her work, even though it's horror, it's based in history, right? And I don't know if it was an uncle or somebody like that was killed in what school was that Colson Whitehead wrote about? That particular school for boys. But I'm really interested in reading this because this has a horror lens. But her horror is emotional horror oftentimes. And so I'm really interested in leaning into that. And so I'm just going to see those 2.
Okay, great. And those are my questions. Thanks so much. Now it's time for the audience, right? Yes. Great.
So if our audience has questions, please call them out. I will repeat them for our online audience, and we'll take it from there. I have an online question actually to kick us off, which is, you answered the first part of this, but I'm going to say the first part anyway and then lead us into the second. So what was your process for writing this book, and how did you know it was complete?
Yeah, I think I answered the process in terms of writing the book. I may add to it that it was important to have visual elements to it, so I would do research and then also look on my iPhone for photos that I had taken and then either do drawings or adjust those photos. How did I know it was finished? It told me so. Now, that might sound weird, but as a visual artist, if you put too much, sometimes your stuff's going to turn to mud. So you have to learn how to just like let it go.
Sounds about right. I have another online question.
Okay.
What do you miss about living in California?
The ocean, being able to swim in it without a wetsuit. In Southern California, that is. Northern California is a little different. Monterey Canyon is the actual place where the underwater, I don't want to say colony, but, development, if you will, is. But you need a wetsuit in Northern California. I can get a little bit of that in the ocean if I go to North Carolina. It's obviously very different, and it feels like bathwater at times in the summer. So I'd say the ocean.
Oh, yes.
Question for you. Your book is fascinating. There's so many layers to it. Have you ever thought about teaching yourself? Because it seems like you'd have a lot to teach.
I have a story about teaching. I didn't want to be a teacher because I started as a MFA program in visual arts and sculpture. And as a graduate student, a kid didn't show up to school or class, and I gave him a D. And I realized when I got pressure from the administration that that's how it can work, where someone who donates money to a school, they can pressure you to give them a better grade. I wasn't having any of that, so I left. And then when I went to graduate school in creative writing, a lot of people, that's you know, as artists, you think that that's going to be your track. Well, you do your art and you'll get, you know, a full-time job teaching. And so the answer is no, I've never thought about that. Another triggering kind of thing. Yeah. That's a little bit more difficult. I love your hat, Oakland. I just saw that. I think that's more challenging. I would say that's definitely more challenging. You can do too. I can do too much research and then like procrastinate almost, and then not write what I need to be writing. So it's something I have to keep in check. That's a good question.
I've got another online
Okay.
question. Um, This one asks about your opinions about art and literature and how they are impacted by AI trends today.
I think for creatives, particularly, maybe not so much writers, but particularly photographers or animators or folks that have made their living using their hands, their eyes, their minds to create art, they're at risk. And they know it, right? I have not tried to use Chat GPT or anything like that. I'm using AI, we all do really to a certain degree. It's an algorithm when you start typing something and it's autocorrect. We can't avoid it, but that's, I don't think we can avoid it. What things look like in the future, this book primarily is set in 2035, who knows? But yeah, folks are going to be, out of work to a certain degree. You've got to retool and somehow retool, just like the federal workers are thinking about right now, where they did not expect ever, right? Ever. And maybe one reason you go into something like that, because you want stability. So we're all, it's not just AI, right? We're we're all in this pressure cooker to sort of look at ourselves and say what, maybe not just upskilling, but how we think about the world. That's a long-winded answer to that question, but
It's spot on. Thank you. I have another one from the online audience. They're very talkative tonight.
okay. And then there was a couple over here.
What are you working on next? Are you working on anything next?
A play, actually, called The Sojourners. And it's a world where there's a trans couple, and it's a world not too far, another near future, where basically you're illegal. I've written a play before, full length, and hopefully it'll be on its feet this year or a little bit later, where African American art was illegal, right? I mean, this is, teaching Black history is illegal. This stuff is not far away. And I tend to do that. I mean, I think that the ephemera collector is similar in that space of finding stuff that it's far but not far-fetched.
Yes.
I haven't read, but I can't wait to dive in. I wanted to know, writing and being an art class can be very solitary. Is she among any community that can help her keep her memory?
If you read it, you'll find out the community, they're algorithms that are, yeah. Yeah, and something interesting happens. Yes. Um, so yes, she's married to, she forgets. Um, but yeah, she's married to a woman. As she comes to, so to speak, there's representation in that way. The book is not about being queer, but I told a friend who's religious, it's like, Helena, there's some parts in this book that you shouldn't read. She's like, okay, okay, okay. So there's some explicit stuff in there.
I think those are all of our questions for this evening, so please
Thank you.
help me thank our moderator tonight, Leslie Tenorio. And our author, Stacy Nathaniel Jackson. And now it is all of your duties to buy books tonight. If you haven't already, our bookselling partner, Greedy Reads, is outside ready to sell you some books. And thank you for joining us this evening, and we hope to see you again. Thank you.